Good morning. Thank you for joining the Vegas Chamber Legislative Roundup. My name is Dylan Keith, policy analyst at the Vegas Chamber. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly let you know that we want to hear from you. Please type any questions you have into the comment box, and we'll be able to answer all questions at the end of the webinar. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Vegas Chamber President and CEO, Mary Beth Seawald.
Thank you so much, Dylan. I really appreciate that introduction. Before we get started this morning, I want to thank Western States Petroleum Association for generously sponsoring our event today. We truly appreciate their support, continued support of the Vegas Chamber. Also want to thank our BizPack donors who are on the call today. Without your donations, we really wouldn't be able to support candidates who understand the needs and challenges of employers and small business owners. So we're extremely grateful for your contributions as well. Before we start, I want to highlight just a couple of upcoming Vegas Chamber programs for everybody. I keep mentioning this and we're excited about it. Our annual Washington, D.C. fly-in is coming up. That's September 20th through the 23rd. You really don't want to miss that. We're going to DC this year. It's in person. It's a great opportunity for you to help elevate our voice in Washington, DC. And it's also a great place for you to make invaluable connections. So reservations are going fast. We're just about all booked up, but I really do encourage you to sign up just as soon as you can at vegaschamber.com. Also, June, this month, it's June already, can't believe that. It's National Safety Month. And next week, the Vegas Chamber is going to host a membership luncheon on June 24th. That's in person, membership luncheon. That's going to focus on how Vegas is evolving to make our community safe for visitors post-COVID. We have a great lineup for you, including Steve Hill, the president and CEO of the LVCVA. We have Lawrence Epstein. He's the COO of UFC. And then also we have Stephanie Glanzer, and she's the Chief Sales Officer of MGM. So you're definitely not going to want to miss that. Once again, that luncheon is next week on June 24th. Also, enrollment is open for our Leadership Advance program. Leadership Advance is a leadership skills development program. It's a proven course for helping talented employees at all levels become a lot more effective organizational leaders who can help your business grow and thrive. So please go to leadership.vegas for more information on that. All right, and now it is my pleasure to introduce someone who, without their leadership throughout this entire session, I really don't know where we would be. He was absolutely invaluable to us. He's the chairman of the Vegas Chamber's Government Affairs Committee, and he's the managing director at Hightower Las Vegas, Mr. Hugh Anderson. Hey, Hugh.
Good morning, Mary Beth. How are you today?
Great, thank you.
I want to thank all of our members who are watching today, because without them, none of this is possible. When the 2021 legislative session started, we knew it was going to be daunting, but the reality is it certainly lived up to its reputation. It was very, very challenging. Bills that were being proposed could have devastated many of our small business members, as well as even large businesses. There were 84 bills that our Las Vegas Government Affairs team faced, and they were bad business bills, literally bad. Our team was able to either mitigate or outright defeat the majority of those bills, actually all of them, to make sure that we protected our environment and keep it strong and recovering from the pandemic. This is in large part due to the Chamber's Political Action Committee Fund, BizPack, as Mary Beth just mentioned. BizPack is critically important for us to be able to do what we do. And what is that? It's to find and support candidates who get it, who get and understand the fact that you sign the front of your paychecks and you're the ones who make this economy thrive and grow. So BizPack helps us find those candidates, support them, and encourage them to recognize what helps our members grow. It's an essential to supporting those candidates who will work with the business community and understands our challenges. And they keep their door open. They listen. They also seek us out for advice and guidance, because our experts, our government affairs team, all of them who you're going to hear from in a minute, are their essential source for critical information as they approach their votes on various bills. So now that the legislature has ended, we're focused on the future, including upcoming elections and potential ballot initiatives that will impact you. Having a well-funded BizPack is essential to our success in representing and protecting you. If you've already given to BizPack, thank you, thank you, thank you. Your support is vital. If you've never donated to BizPack, please do so. If you have questions about it or the process or anything, feel free to give Paul and his team, me, any of us on the Government Affairs Committee a call or an email to explain and walk you through how vital your dollars are. It's an investment in the health and welfare of your business and our economic climate. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the Vegas Chamber's Chair, Gina Von Jovi.
Thank you, Hugh. Good morning, everybody. As Hugh mentioned, the Chamber did an outstanding job of protecting and looking out for employers and small businesses this session. It was an amazing feat considering the number of proposals we were up against, as Mary Beth mentioned. And had it not been for the Vegas Chamber, you'd be facing several proposals that would negatively impact you. And I've said this many times since becoming chair, the Chamber's Government Affairs Committee and team and representation up in Carson City and federally is really the #1 reason why I am and continue to be a Chamber member. As you will hear, as we go through this legislative wrap-up, they look out for my business in ways that I can't do myself. At the beginning of the session, I issued a call to action for members to become Chamber advocates, and nearly 200 of you answered this call, which was invaluable help to amplify the Vegas Chamber's voice and the voice of small business here in Nevada. Thank you to all the Chamber advocates who posted social media, sent emails and letters to lawmakers, and testified on various pieces of legislation. We really, truly appreciate your engagement. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Mary Beth.
All right. Thank you so much, Gina. We really appreciate your leadership throughout this entire session and through the year so far. So thank you for being such a great chair. All right. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Paul Moradkin. He's the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs, along with the Chamber's outside lobbying team, Jim and Jesse Wadhams of Black & Wadhams. Hi, guys.
Morning, Mary Beth. Thanks so much for joining us today, everyone, and we appreciate your engagement. As Gina said, we had a successful session. Jim and Jesse and I are going to walk through some of the highlights of the session. For those that are on video today, you'll be able to follow us along with the PowerPoint presentation that we're able to share with you today. So starting with our first slide, we'll go through a couple of the components. As many of you recall, the Chamber issues a legislative mission, and part of that mission this cycle really was to recover, rebuild, and reinvent Nevada together. We understood that recovery begins with Nevada's employers and employees as part of our economic recovery from COVID-19. Part of that conversation, of course, was knowing that the competition is out there. And what we mean by that, not only is Nevada trying to recover, but our neighboring Intermountain West states, such as Utah, Colorado, Idaho, New Mexico. Those are some of the states that we're competing against as we work to recover and to diversify our economy. And of course, as Gina touched on and Hugh, our commitment was to you, our members, the employers of our state's business community. And throughout the session, of course, we had our legislative guiding principles that really were focused to ensure that the state's business economic climate was preserved and maintained to allow you to do your business. One of the primary responsibilities of the Vegas Chamber is to be your voice in Carson City so you can focus on your business and grow and recover and bring Nevadans back to work. Of course, throughout the session, Jim and Jesse and our team, along with Erica, David, and Dylan, advocated and pursued public policy issues that would foster the economic recovery, grow grow and also create additional jobs in Southern Nevada and statewide. And of course, prioritize entrepreneurship and innovation and small business success. And we'll go on to the next slide, please. Of course, we issued our legislative plan that was developed by the Government Affairs Committee, that was executed upon by our team. And of course, we shared that with our members through the business voice, email communication, the rundown, social media, stakeholders in Carson City, the governor's office, legislative leadership, and legislators in general. Go on to the next one, please. Jim and Jesse are going to jump on this conversation also, but what we prepared for you was just a snapshot of some of the bills that Gina and Hugh mentioned that were problematic to the business community going into the session. There were over 1,000 bills introduced for consideration. As Hugh said, there were over 80 bills that were of concern to the business community. And this slide and the following slide give a snapshot on some of those bills. Jim, I'll turn it over to you to add some perspective to that conversation.
Yeah, Paul, I appreciate that. I think this session was really very surprising in a lot of ways. Um, as some of your members who were on earlier calls, maybe even the pre-session calls, there was serious discussion and contemplation that perhaps the legislative session would be more limited and they would try to focus on the budget because of COVID, and that there would be a later special session in which the broader policy issues would be discussed. And the reason I say that is because A, it didn't happen, but B, the discussion really was based upon a reality that really separated this session from all others that we've had, and that is COVID. Throughout the year of 2020, as all of your listeners and viewers know, we were in a period of some level of pandemic response. For the first several months, businesses were essentially locked down, shut down, unless they were declared to be an essential business, and even then, access was very severely restricted. Many of us were either laid off or placed in or required to stay in our homes, and so that began 2020. 2020, of course, was a campaign year, and there wasn't door-to-door knocking. And so when we get to Carson City, frankly, I think the entire state, maybe even the whole country and the world, is in somewhat of a state of post-traumatic stress disorder, and the reaction, I think, was fairly dramatic. As Paul mentioned, we saw 1,000 bills. And in addition to the subtle social disorientation that came from essentially the country and our state being placed in quarantine, was really the business dislocation of businesses being shut down and employees either being able to function from home, or in the case particularly of our hospitality industry or our hotel industry, literally being laid off. And I think that brought a lot of pent-up anxiety to the legislative process. In some respects, that government-ordered shutdown almost seemed, in the legislation that was being introduced, to be blamed upon employers. And if you flash back on that list that Paul put up briefly, many of the bills that were introduced had a very anti-employer flavor, as if employers had been doing something wrong during this period of shutdown. And obviously, those of you who are watching this realize that employers were just hoping that they could continue to pay the rent, pay the fixed costs until hopefully this pandemic would ease and we could start getting customers back in. So it was a very, very challenging session. The session itself started out with the legislature being in a building by itself, and that certainly creates a whole set of problems. And I think the interaction between the legislators and those of us who were trying to communicate became very difficult. It had to be virtual, which means it was either through Zoom meetings. Hearings were done by Zoom meeting, but not interactive like we are today. They were more like watching a television show. And so the communication with legislators was largely by telephone and by email. Paul, that's a pretty long-winded setup, but let me toss it back to you and see where we want to go next.
Appreciate that, Jesse. Thanks. So we'll bring back the PowerPoint slide for a moment on that list of bills. And to Jim's point, when you see that list of bills of concern to the chamber, you're dealing with collective bargaining, you're dealing with healthcare, employer retaliation language, right to repair, employment, business liability, workers' comp, non-compete, price gouging. That's just a snapshot of some of the issues we were dealing with the session. If we go to the next slide, please. And so while we wait for that next slide, as you can see, we also dealt with a lot of affordable housing issues, fiscal home rule, taxation, climate standards, and so forth. And they're really, when you see that compounding effect, it's not just one bill that was a concern. It was a significant list of bills that could fundamentally change the state's business climate. And the reason the chamber is so adamant about protecting that business climate is that the state's reputation on a national level must be business friendly. When employers are looking at new states to relocate, we don't want them skipping over Nevada. We want them to relocate to Nevada. And we also want to ensure our existing employers and businesses are able to grow and expand. So that was part of the chamber's mission also. Jesse, obviously, you're instrumental part of our team. Any perspective you want to add about some of the bills and themes we saw throughout the session?
Well, no, I appreciate that, Paul, and appreciate your whole team inviting us to be on the on this presentation today. I think you and Jim both hit on probably the broad themes. I think really what was sort of surprising to me was that while we were in a pandemic, while we're in a lockdown situation, the legislative session decided operated virtually. And while you would tend to think that would make the process maybe there would have been less bills or less sort of contentious issues, and that was certainly one of the rumors, we ended up with just about the same number of bills, the same number of processed issues, really not very far off a standard session pace, which for folks that have ever been in the Carson City Legislative Building during a session, that it's teeming with people and activity. And in this virtual environment, you'd think that we would have sort of slowed down, taken a breather, and kind of worked a little more methodically, but that didn't actually end up being the case. So, that's sort of where it was just sort of fascinating in that it didn't end up being a limited or pandemic session, despite the fact that it was a complete lockout of the building. So that's kind of the perspective I would like folks to understand.
Well, Jesse, I think you just. Oh, go ahead. I think, Jesse, you just brought up an excellent point. If you look back 10 years ago through the Chamber's legislative agenda, we would typically oppose maybe 10 to 12 bills. And for a pandemic session, we were dealing with over 80 bills. And as we were talking about just a moment ago, the broad breadth of issues was extensive. And I think that was a bit of a surprise, I think, to a lot of folks who were involved from the lobbying perspective, how many bills and how intricate they were and complex.
Well, I think that's exactly right. We really didn't, you had complex issues, complex bills that fundamentally affected, say, the employer-employee relationship, affected the way businesses do business day to day. And yet we're in a virtual session. We're in that, have a very limited ability to interact with people. In fact, for the first 72 days of the 120-day session, the building was completely locked down and locked away from the public. And while you can have participatory meetings like this, or you can send in messages or have virtual meetings, you just can't have that interaction. You can't have that sort of dialogue that sort of creates the ability to understand better. You can sort of drift off, or you can do other things, or you can sort of set your meetings in a way that really avoid the conversation. So it was just sort of I guess all sessions are unique. This one was just more unique than most.
No, absolutely. And Jesse's right. I mean, it is. We always joke internally that every session you use is unique, but this one really was different, and one I personally hope we don't repeat again. So let's move on to the rest of our presentation. So we'll go on to the next slide. So a couple of the parts of any session, of course, are who the legislative players are, and obviously legislators are the key components of that, along with the governor, and Governor Slack and his office were great to work with. But I'm going to turn it over to Jim to add some perspective regarding the Senate Democrats. So, Jim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Paul. And before I jump into that, I just wanted to add just a little piece on the tail end of what you and Jesse were just talking about. If there's a chance to look quickly again at those bills, and it's not important to do that at the moment, but just reflect upon that. We had a bill on the right to return to work, obviously related to COVID, because people had been laid off, and the issue was I want my job back and you've got to give it to me. There was an issue in price gouging, and not to make light of it, but there was a sense in the public that perhaps people were taking advantage of the empty shelves and maybe brokering and gouging on the price of toilet paper or bottled water. Just as another example, the bill on the extension of paid time off really was the frustration that people had. I've lost my job and I got to make sure my employer is paying me for this time. So it really did reflect a lot of angst about what had been happening in the throughout 2020. With that, let me jump into what you asked me to talk about, and that's the top of the chart, the Senate Democrats. Both houses, of course, were controlled by the Democrats. Nicole Cannizzaro, who was on the top of the list, was the Senate Majority Leader. Well, is the Senate Majority Leader, and in her second cycle as Majority Leader. So she's basically responsible for running the agenda, running the meeting, so to speak, in the Senate. She had several bills that I think presented significant challenge. For example, that right to return to work was her bill, as was another bill that will be mentioned here later, the so-called public option. Part of the challenge is that in past sessions, when we had better access inside the building, we had more frequent and in-person meetings with that leadership group, which Nicole heads. And that didn't happen as much because we were virtual. As the session developed, it turns that although just elected, there is some sense that perhaps Nicole Cannizzaro wants to be appointed to a federal judgeship or a U.S. attorney position, and that can change the perspective of how a person looks at the job and the reasons that they are trying to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish. Julia Ratty, a fairly well-experienced legislator, who also had some time on the city council up in northern Nevada, had expressed some frustration with the process that she might not return. She is a bright, energetic legislator, and because of that, has a broader influence than just her own vote in that process. And the seeming distraction of what she was looking at doing or perhaps not doing, created some issues. And finally, Senator Pat Spearman, who is from the northeast corner of the valley, a female who is an ordained minister, a veteran, a wide experience, and also a lady that chaired the Senate Commerce and Labor Committee, which of course for business turns out to be one of the critical committees. Her approach to running the business, to running the organization of that committee, really turned out to be a bit problematic. It was difficult to get meetings, to communicate with her, and it made the effort of making sure that the responsibility of business to be able to function in order to maintain employment. It was difficult to get that kind of attention out of that committee, and so with the leadership, with those three ladies, it sort of enhanced the difficulty and challenge working on some of these bills that you saw on the previous slides. Back to you, Paul.
Next, we're going to go over to Jesse, who's going to give a perspective about the Assembly Democrats, similar to Jim's comments. Jesse?
Yeah, interestingly, that with regard to the Assembly Democrats, you've got usually the Senate tends to be the little more senior side of the House, and the Assembly tends to be the sort of the younger group. And while that may be true in just sheer terms of time and service, what was interesting, I think, is the Assembly Democrats really sort of had the sort of the more cohesive group, if you will. Assembly Speaker Frierson has got a fair bit of experience. He's been a legislator for a long while now, and has a good sense of the process, a good sense of the building, and a good sense of how to run the operations of the building. So I think you see from him an ability to sort of navigate a session. Interestingly, I think he did sort of take that, not to describe too much that I don't know, but I think he kind of tried to take a step back and really let the process work, and really not try to push lots of bills of his own. Excuse me. You couple that with the experience of Assemblywoman Maggie Carlton, who is going to be the first legislator turned out of both houses, so the longest serving female legislator in Nevada history, and her experience is incalculable. It's her running of the Finance Committee in the Senate, and then the Assembly Ways and Means Committee over the course of time has been, I think, critical to her understanding how the pieces of the state's finance picture works. So you've got, coupled with Assemblyman Frierson and Assemblywoman Carlton, that level of experience sort of keeps the trains running on time in the assembly. I think a little bit sort of more focused, and then Assemblywoman Howdeggy really stepped up. She's I think in her third session now, and took over chair of Commerce and Labor in the Assembly side. Again, that committee that really focuses in on most of the broad business issues, things like employer-employee relationship, things like business regulation. So seeing that, she really stepped up, and I think she ran a great committee. I think she really was accessible, was thoughtful, worked through the issues, and really tried to process bills in a meaningful, thoughtful way. That committee has just a ton of work. Probably one of the, but got to be one of the largest overviews of jurisdiction in the building. And so she did a great job. So I think you see the Assembly leadership really making you're trying to really focus the session in ways, and then you had a sort of counterpoint with the Senate, which was a little bit more, maybe for lack of a better word, I'd say there was a lot more sort of individual issues in the Senate. So, Paul.
Thanks, Jesse. And then when you look at the Senate Republicans and their key players, you'll see Senator Settlemyre, Senator Gocochea, Senator Ganzert, and Senator Kiekhaefer. The reason they were so important in the process is because of how long they've been in the Senate. Senator Kiekhaefer has served on Senate Finance for many years. This is his last session. Senator Gocochea is extremely helpful in water issues and land use. Senator Settlemyre was the minority leader and is a small business owner himself, understands the issues when it comes to regulation, workers' comp, tort reform. And then Senator Ganzert really is looked as a bipartisan negotiator, trying to bring both parties together on common sense legislation. So that's why they were important in the process. And then when you look at the Assembly Republicans, last session, they were in the super minority, which means they had less than 1/3 of the membership in the Assembly. So when it even came to tax situations, their votes, unfortunately, didn't really have an impact on the process. This session, they were just in the minority. So when it came to 2/3 votes, it meant you had to pick up 2 Republicans to pass something through on a revenue bill or a taxation issue. And that's where Assemblywoman Tolles and Assemblyman Roberts came into play. As more of the moderates of that caucus, they signaled that they were willing to work with Democrats in a bipartisan fashion, which is always important as you're trying to deal with the end game, as they say. But also, though, Tom Roberts was also very helpful as a co-chair of the Southern Nevada Forum, and was engaged in quite a few different bills and helped shepherd through many of those initiatives. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. And as we wait for the slides, I will say, the chamber did a phenomenal job really working well with both Republicans and Democrats this session. We are a bipartisan organization. To Hugh's earlier comments about BizPac, the chamber supports a large amount of Republicans and Democrats both. So what we have next on here is who the stakeholders were outside the legislative body. So from the business community, what we call the Big Five, you have the Nevada Mining Association, the Nevada Resort Association, the association, the retailers, the realtors, and of course, the Vegas Chamber. Those five groups really make up the business community on the broad-based issues. Of course, mining works with mining issues, which compounds into water and land use. The Resort Association, of course, is the economic engine of the state on Las Vegas Boulevard and is the largest employer of employees in the state. The realtors, we work closely with them on affordable housing issues and so forth. And then, of course, retail comes down to taxation and worker comp issues. So these five groups have worked exceptionally well together the last few years. And that's where a united business community comes in so handy as we're talking about all these slew of bills. For example, when it came down to housing issues, David Daslich and our team work with the realtors because they're the subject matter experts. We provide support. We will lobby with them on those issues. And that's just an example of how we collaborate with the business community. Then, of course, on the other side, you have the progressives. You have ACLU. You have Battleborn Progress. You have PLAN. You'll have the Public Defender's Office engaged on social justice issues. And then on the labor side, also, you have ASME, which is the state union for state employees. You have AFL-CIO. You have Culinary Workers Local 226 in Vegas. You have the Laborers Union 782, and then you have the Southern Nevada Building and Trades. And the reason I bring these up, and Jim's going to talk about this in a moment, is that these outside groups work with national groups at times that bring in special interests and so forth to run a different agenda that may not be uniquely Nevada. And I think that was an important theme we were seeing out throughout the session. So, Jim, I'll turn over to you to add a little bit of perspective to that. And if we could go to the next slide while we do that, that'd be great.
Thanks, Paul. I think that slide is really kind of interesting because it identifies three groups of stakeholders. There certainly are more than those three, but I think that those three in this particular session probably were fairly representative. I suppose the other one that you might want to add, if we were to broaden the discussion, would be the plaintiff's attorneys, sometimes called the Nevada Justice Association. And that can be a challenge for business when we're talking about issues of business liability, of workers' compensation. And so that's another element. I think the dramatic piece is that middle group on the previous chart, which Paul labels as the progressives. And while some of those names may be familiar, there are others, such as the ACLU, which, as most people realize, started out just representing civil liberties and defending our primary amendment, 10 Amendment rights of freedom of speech and freedom of worship and freedom of press and that sort of thing, but really has moved now into more of that group that's labeled as progressive. Interestingly, the Public Defender's Office, which really is a public office of public employees, has emerged as much more active and supportive of these social issues. The two in the middle on that list, Battleborn Progress, Progressive Leadership Alliance, are representative of probably another 8 to 10 other smaller groups, and they are beginning to be called NGOs, which is an acronym for non-governmental organizations, which really doesn't mean anything, except it's just a way to refer to them other than saying, well, are they groups or are they progressives or what are they? They really are generally single issue groups that have a particular focus and have become very skilled at using the social media to identify people who care about a particular issue and then catalyzing that into a social media presence. Over the course of my time, and I've worked in representing business in the Nevada legislature for several decades, and this emergence of these national groups and their national agendas is really been quite dramatic in the last 5 or 6 years in Nevada, and it's changing the conversation, and it's changing the focus of the legislators, not just because the perspective that they bring to it, but the process by which they bring that perspective. It is very intense and very focused, and requires those of us who actually have a permanent long-term stake in Nevada as our home to look at the bigger picture and to try to counterbalance that. We saw many bills, and Jesse and Paul mentioned there were nearly 1,000 bills introduced, and many of them had no origination from Nevada. They had come from one of these national groups, these NGOs, or it had come from a national political party that is trying this around the country. It's part of building a state-based agenda to support their national agenda of ultimately affecting federal law and preempting the states from doing what they want to do. And I raise that because I think it's really important. And as similar as we may be to our neighboring states in terms of climate and geography, we aren't very similar in any respect to the states, what I call back east, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, the District of Columbia, Maryland. We have a different climate, a different geography, and I think we have a completely different culture. And so national agenda items don't necessarily work for Nevada, and that is creating a bit of a problem, particularly in an environment in which the general public's access to the process and ability to participate is limited. And I'm going to take just one more few seconds and add to that. Limited because in the fall of 2020, we didn't see the door-to-door campaigning that Nevadans, in some cases, we get a little irritated by it, but it also gives us an opportunity to see and actually listen to the people that are running for office. We're fortunate to be close enough that we can have interaction with our legislators. Since we had COVID in 2020, you didn't have those kinds of campaigns. They were done through the media, and that separates, I think, legislators from the people, but it also allows those national groups that have focused agendas to interpose and create the ambiance for the national agenda. And unfortunately, we saw several bills that the chamber had to work very hard to either mitigate or defeat, coming from places like the state of Washington, coming from Massachusetts, coming from Maryland, coming from places that have no direct relationship with Nevada whatsoever. Back to you, Paul.
I mean, I think that's a great important perspective for members to understand some of those changing dynamics. Going on to the next slide, if you look at the different themes that we have experienced this past session, and Jim touched on it from the NGOs that were talking about the business community, there is a story that's being told that our members are large out-of-state corporations. And I'm going to quote our CEO, Mary Beth Seedwall, who constantly will tell legislators and stakeholders that the business community is made up of mostly small businesses. Over 85% are small business under 50. And if you look at that and see who's actually under 15, it's the majority of them. So you have that comparison trying to create that story that every single one is a multi-billion-dollar corporation, which just isn't true. There's also that perspective that it's employer versus employee. From the chamber perspective, that is the absolute opposite. For a business to do well, you need to have good employees. For employees to do well, you need to have supportive employers. And many of our employers through the pandemic did the right thing. They kept employees on to pay their health care. They paid them as long as they could and so forth with not having the doors open. Our employers are members of the community. They live next door to you. They live in the state. They go. Their kids go to the same schools as employees' children. There should not be a versus attitude. And unfortunately, that is some of the issues we're dealing with. But the biggest issue we heard, and Jim and Jesse can jump on this, is that every time the chamber identified a bill that was problematic from the employer side, from the business community side, we would be told, well, why are you concerned about it? It's only for bad actors. Well, first of all, the way how drafting with legislation occurs, it can easily set an employer up for litigation and frivolous lawsuits. So that was a concern for the chamber. There's also this lack of acknowledgement sometimes that there can be and are bad employees too. It's not one-sided. So that was an ongoing issue for the business community throughout the session. And of course, there was a shift in the legislative process that the more regulations, the better a business will be or better corporate partner. That's not true. If you look at what happened in California, I don't think anybody ever points to that our neighboring state as a business-friendly state. And that's why that's why folks are leaving that state, going to Texas, for example, Utah, Nevada, because we're a more friendly state for employers. So we'll go on to the next slide. So what the chamber did in response to everything that Jim and Jesse were referring to is we really took a whole new approach to our legislative session. Of course, we were in Carson City on day one. We have offices up there. The team was up there full time with Jim and Jesse. Our CEO was constantly in Carson meeting with folks too. So that was important to have that physical presence. At the same time, the chamber held a weekly trade association call with another 40 representatives from trucking, auto dealers, mining, every single sector of the business community that has a trade association. We convened together with the retail association to coordinate bills, testimony, strategic approach to do that. It was also mentioned earlier on that we would meet with legislative leadership and caucus staff as their schedules permitted and to go through bills and concerns. And Speaker Firestone, for example, was the one who started this process a couple years ago, and very much appreciative for him to do that because that allowed the chamber and its partners to have a dedicated time to go through bills with him and his team, and to really have to thank Speaker for his ongoing communication with the business community. We also had a weekly communication call with the trade associations. Many of you know Kara Clark, our VP of Comms, and Dylan Keith, our policy analyst. They did a phenomenal job putting together this communications group for the first time, working on talking points, social media, coordinating it with the rest of the trades when an anti-business or bad business bill came up for hearing. Everyone was on the same page and so forth. We also responded in a timely manner. And what we don't do at the chamber and our business colleagues we don't make the tax personal. We always keep it above the bar. We focus on the policy. We don't go after other individuals if we disagree with them. We don't make it personal. We had a phenomenal relationship with the governor's office. Our chamber leadership, which include Gina and Hugh and Mary Beth, met with the governor several times throughout the session about different bills and legislation. He was a great listener and was helpful to the chamber on a lot of bills, so we appreciate Governor Sisolak for his assistance. And so we'll move on to the next slide, please. Another thing we did really well this session is we leveraged all of our media assets. So you saw the chamber on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, e-communications, the rundown, the Paul call, the Carson call. But what we also did was every single time we leveraged our publication pieces, the Business Voice, every single one of those cover stories was legislative focused. It was strategic. It was based on sound policy and fact-based data. So we're talking about the Southern Nevada Forum. We're talking about the economic impact of these bills would have in our community. When we're talking about federal grants and why we need to capture another $500 million in money back to our state and how it will improve the lives of Nevadans, we had those numbers. And of course, in our May issue, we have the UNLV Medical School building and Advanced Engineering building, and how those facilities are game changers in our community. So again, we leveraged what we had, was very well received, and this complemented the lobbying efforts of the staff, but also of our leadership and our executive office with our CEO. So an important overlay where everything was coordinated and strategically done. We'll go on to the next slide, please. Gina Bonjovi, our chair, made a few comments about the Chamber Advocate Program. This really was our first coordinated effort to execute on this plan. Chair Bonjovi brought up in her state of the chamber earlier in the year. And we had over 200 members, about 200 members participate. In the past, we would have maybe 5 or 6. this was a game changer for us. And this really allowed to put that personal perspective from our members into hearing rooms, testifying, social media, and many of you stepped up and helped on many of those bills throughout the session. So I know Gina thanked you, but I'd like to thank you also for your commitment and engagement with the Vegas Chamber this session. Next, we'll go to the next slide, please. And then finally, on some legislative highlights, and Jim and Jesse mentioned this, there was 1,161 bills, 998 were introduced. The chamber portfolio was 637, which is about average. We testified on 127 bills, which is right on mark for us. But then we had 87 bills that we had problems with. And this was 20 more than last session, which was 40 more the previous session. So you see a pattern where the bills are becoming more problematic, more complex, but you're also seeing duplicative bills. So there isn't just one housing bill. There may be 4 or 5. There may be 5 or 6 mining bills, or 3 or 4 worker comp bills. I mean, you're seeing repetitive bills coming back over and over again every session. So the chamber was able to kill 31 bills with its partners. 55 were mitigated, and 4 bills were vetoed by the governor. So that just gives you a snapshot of what happened in the session. We can go to the next slide, please. So key opposition bills, and I'm going to turn this over really quickly to Jim and Jesse, but SB 386, which was the right to return bill, and SB 420 was to the healthcare public option bill. So Jim and Jesse.
Jesse, go ahead on 386, and I'll jump in on 420.
No, 386 is the that right to return bill that Senator Cannizzaro worked with the Culinary Union. Obviously, that was a bill largely directed at the hospitality industry, gaming, the convention centers, and the airports. And so that bill was largely, I guess, for lack of a better way, putting it that the gamers and others in the hospitality industry sort of take the lead because it was very focused. But as originally drafted, it is notable to say that would have applied much more broadly. If you had a tavern with a restricted gaming license, it would have applied. So it would have applied to small businesses in its original iteration. So thanks to the business community, I think it was largely refocused and sort of repositioned to look more directly at the large gaming enterprises and the hospitality, convention centers and businesses, and then it did secure a small business exemption through the advocacy of your chair, Mary Beth Seawold. Yep.
Paul, let me jump in on just to finish Jesse's point in a way. That bill was narrowed down to focus on certain large employers, and while we still opposed it, it was amended to avoid implication of small business. But it's a point that Paul raised on an earlier slide, that the general tenor, the general thinking in the legislature was the consensus that all businesses are large and abusive to their employees. And as many of our members, as many of you folks know, that's absolutely the opposite of what is small business. Most of us in small business, we know our employees personally, we know their families, we know their spouses, we go to their kids' parties, and it's a much different environment than all businesses are abusive employers. So let me jump to 420. 420 is an interesting bill, and it's called the one that's called the public option. From a small business standpoint and from a Main Street business standpoint, it's very problematic because what it creates is a mandatory system mandated by the public, by the government, that doctors and hospitals have to function at below cost for a private insurance company that is required to participate and function and sell products 5% less than they can sell them in the competitive market. And it's designed to address a problem of uninsured people in Nevada. The difficulty is that that's going to disrupt all of our group health insurance. And as many of you know, the Chamber itself has a small employer program that has stabilized access to health insurance. And so this SB 420 has a delayed effective date. It doesn't go into effect until January of 2026. But the fact that it exists, I think, is going to discourage physicians staying active in their practice, will definitely discourage physicians from coming to Nevada. And that's going to make access to care difficult for all of us in the meantime. And as this project is further examined, I'm afraid it's probably going to have damage. It's going to cause damage to our already fragile healthcare system that was kind of stretched like a rubber band during the pandemic. So that bill was amended slightly, and it has a delayed effective date. And I suspect that it will be on our list for 2023 to try to further mitigate. Thanks, Paul.
So just quickly, we know there was also a concern about SB 373. This bill ended up not processing. It would give NCHIEF faculty the right to collectively bargain. The Chamber has issues with that type of legislation because of the impact on taxpayers. AB 222 was a bill regarding workplace safety. It was pretty much gutted, and this dealt finally with a final provision about Equal Rights Commission. So that was a couple of the opposition bills. I will move on to the higher education priorities. The Chamber worked successfully with many partners on higher education reform, from an audit study bill to land grant designation for UNLV, UNR, and DRI. And those were significant to the Chamber to get those bills passed this session. So those are some of the higher education success stories for the organization. If we can go to the next slide, please. While we wait for the slides and so forth, then I just want to close and say we also, of course, worked on the Southern Nevada Forum, and I have to thank, I thank Dylan Keith for all his work shepherding that through. The forum had some major successes this session, from from federal grants to dual credit through the community college system, education funding. So we did a great job with that. I'm going to turn over to Jim real quick to give a quick update about the mining tax compromise, and then we'll go into questions and answers for the remainder of the hour. Jim?
Yeah, I'm going to try to be brief, but I'd like to give you some highlights because it was a pretty significant issue in the press, and quite frankly, a pretty significant issue. The so-called mining tax compromise really stemmed from the adoption during the special sessions last summer of three resolutions that would go on the ballot if they passed again. Two of them would increase the tax on mining by 500%, and the third one would have increased it by 300%. And so mining was looking at a circumstance that probably would compromise, if not just extinguish their existence. So they were, in effect, had a gun to their head to try to find some compromise that would allow them to continue economically to sustain themselves as a business activity. The interesting elements of it is what finally came out in the so-called end game when the votes had to be acquired, because it required a 2/3 vote. So it required some Republicans on both sides, both the House, the Assembly and the Senate to concur. And the result is that money is being focused on education programs, many of which were supported by this very chamber under prior legislation. So it has kept the opportunity scholarships alive, helped the Silver State Opportunity Grant Program, and so it does provide money for important services. The difficulty with it really is the manner in which it occurred. If you put a gun to the head of a particular industry sector, is that a good way to force a compromise, if you will, and develop tax policy as opposed to using a broad-based tax that spreads the impact as over as large a base as possible. One of the other elements is the first one on this screen, and that's the removal of the teachers union ballot initiatives. That hasn't been tested. It is part of the legislation, but constitutionally it may have a problem. The issue there, of course, is this now going to be the new method by which taxes are increased, that a ballot initiative is filed against a particular sector? In the case of the teachers, it was the sales tax and the gaming tax, but it could be any other industry. They can gain leverage with that and then withdraw it before it goes to the ballot. So it creates a whole new dynamic as to how we can make policy, as opposed to using the deliberative process. We can use leverage and coercion. So it's a challenge I think the chamber is going to want to keep its eye on going forward. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. And so one last comment that Jesse will add is about the upcoming special sessions, and then we'll go back to Mary Beth for questions from the audience. Jesse?
Certainly, I think I appreciate that, Paul. Obviously, we are definitely going to have a special session. The Nevada Constitution mandates that redistricting is done every 10 years following the review or following the census data coming out. And so what will definitely happen is a special session with regard to redistricting of the legislative seats and various local governments, et cetera. So, and then we had been hearing a number of rumors. Maybe the conventional wisdom was that there was some, there'd probably be a special session here in the next, say month and a half with regard to the federal funding that we got through the American Rescue Act. And I think what the legislature did right at the end of session probably pushes that second or that first special session, if you will, on the financing and the federal money, and probably pushes that back out to about the September-October timeframe. So I think conventional wisdom probably should start switching to thinking that there's going to be one special session later that sort of covers any federal funding, any of those issues that are required through the American Rescue Act, and a redistricting, which will sort of, I think, simplify and hopefully expedite any process. Paul.
Today's virtual event. Mary Beth?
Great. Well, thank you, Paul, Jim, and Jesse, for that truly insightful presentation. I really want to thank you all again for all of your work. If we could bring Jim and Jesse back again, and Paul, I want to kind of recap and really give a clear picture of the key components affecting this legislative session. And Jim Wadhams, you mentioned the anti-employer sentiment that we had to deal with this session. And it started, I guess, a while ago, but certainly it was in the last two special sessions. And one that truly characterizes employers as sort of evil. I think there were, I think we can't overstate the impact that these sort of four components had on the session this year. It was that, of course, we were the virtual nature of the session, the legislative makeup, the non-governmental organizations that you talked about, and then the national agendas that were brought to Nevada that originated from out of state. So knowing all of those things again and how things have sort of shaken out for this session, what challenges do you see moving into the next session and maybe the special session that Jesse just talked about?
Well, I see a couple of challenges immediately on the horizon, and it really starts with meetings like this of communicating to the broader membership of the chamber, to small business and Main Street business and large business, that engagement in this process is going to be critical to counterbalance these newer forces and the newer means of communication that have seemed to have really gained some disproportionate influence. We are the basis of employment. The chamber represents all business, and it's going to be critical that we go forward with that. The second thing is insisting that as much as possible that campaigns be done again in person, so that there can be that opportunity to interact with legislators and candidates. And then finally, focusing on communicating with people that are going to be in office, that we are the voice of business, and that business is what puts their constituents to work. 95, as Paul made this statistic, 95% of the businesses in Nevada are small businesses. And about 85% of our workforce is non-union. And so we've got to be making that communication more particularly with our legislators as we go into this next cycle.
Well, and speaking of this next cycle, thank you, Jim, for that. I want to turn it over to Paul for a second. As we continue to look ahead to the special session and the next session in 2023, what are some of the issues, Paul, you think specifically we'll have to continue to fight in 2023, and maybe what are some positive things that we can let our viewers know about?
Sure. No, that's a great question. We know some of these bills that we talked about that were either mitigated or amended or died will come back. We anticipate that paid time leave will come back as a further expansion of the current benefits. Workplace safety will come back. Whistleblower legislation will come back. Workers' comp, tort liability, those we know will come back next session. But things we can also look forward to is that the Southern Nevada Forum will reconvene later on this fall, and we'll get that process started where, again, members in the community can come together on bipartisan legislation, and that really does help transform Southern Nevada. The medical school was a Southern Nevada Forum priority. So is other road construction initiatives, and the engineering, education funding. So there's a lot of good stuff that we work on with our community partners for folks to look forward to next cycle.
All right, very good. Well, it's time to wrap up our conversation today. I really want to thank all of our panelists, Gina Bonjovi, Chairwoman, Hugh Anderson, Paul Muradkin, of course, and Jim and Jesse Wadhams. Thank you guys again for all of your great work. We appreciate your insights and expertise. Also want to thank our sponsor today, Western States Petroleum Association, for your generous support. We can't tell you how much we appreciate you. And thanks to all of you, all of our members who joined us today and who stuck with us throughout the session and throughout this entire pandemic. We sure appreciate your engagement, and we hope that you continue to find the Chamber of great value. So thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing everybody soon. Have a great day.
Thanks, Beth. Thank you, everyone. Take care.